Hello, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to what's the number? Number 30 of 29, okay. Number 29 of our monthly Schools Out event. And just first a few words about the school and what we are offering the next couple of months. The school, I'm just going to think that you know precisely what we are about. But one of the first things that I'd like to point you to is our 3-month dirty old town ideological course on how to become a good urbanist or a good urban dweller. We will start in February and it goes through April. This is last year's dirty old town. It's an amazing course, and I hope that some of you will be convinced. The second thing is something a little bit sooner. This is I think from December. In December, we are offering the Vizivanka workshop. And the Vizivanka is, as probably you may know, is a Ukrainian form of needlework that has both a kind of a folklore type arts and crafts aspect, but also an ideological, nearly military connotations these days because of the way that it intersects with the resistance of the Ukrainian people against the Russian invaders. So this is a course that takes place in 2 weekends in December. And this is the first time we tried it out, just for one evening at our party last spring. And then this is work by Nathaniel Furman, who is going to present other work a little bit later. But this is a workshop that we are doing tomorrow. And tomorrow, together with Adam, we are going to redesign Rotterdam skyscrapers in such a way that they would become diverse, inclusive, and perhaps even queer. Qualities that are tragically lacking in the Rotterdam townscape right now. You can take part still. There are still a couple of places, but also those who do not want to take part in the workshop can come at 11, because Adam will then talk about his own work as a designer tomorrow at 11, exactly where you are right now. So, but now we are here for other business. We are here for a presentation that, well, we invited Adam and Joshua because of this book, Queer Spaces, a book that they edited together, and it was published by in a unique gesture of generosity and tolerance by the RIBA, no, and I say that my irony is not aimed at the RIBA, but more at our own BNA, who would never in their entire existence think of doing such a thing like that. While I think it would be wonderful if there would be a Dutch queer spaces book also. Now, this book for us as an office and as a school that is majority architectural historian, this book is truly it feels like a revolutionary book. To take an idea or a theme like queerness and to use that to break open the existing city and to come up with jewels of spaces that you found and jewels of stories that you found is for us amazing, and it hugely expands the idea of what it is to be an architectural historian. And I talk to you both as architectural historians for the rest of the night, if that is okay. And I'm just taking up time that is better used by Joshua and Adam. And now Joshua is an architectural historian himself, and he teaches at the RC, at the Royal, I never know what the C is, the Royal Committee of Art, or the Royal, the Royal College of Art, and Adam is of course a designer and an architect who actually used to live in this street. Is it okay if I use that as the most important part of your biography? Yeah. 17 years ago, he lived on this very street. You can feel the genius Loki still trembling with his presence. So Adam and Joshua, in a unique combination of talents, have come together to make this book, and I hope that and I'm really glad and really proud that they are here tonight to talk about it. Thank you, guys. Yeah. You thought that was it?
Yeah,
Thanks.
I'm just going to hang with him while he talks.
Okay, all right, great. Screwed up pieces of paper, just a second. Okay, thank you very much for the generous invitation and for having us here together, which is particularly lovely. And thank you all for coming. So I have some screwed up pieces of paper. I'm sorry about that. So I'm going to sort of use those as my guide. And I will add to what was just said and provide my own perspective, which is that of an architectural historian. And as those in the audience here will know, architectural historians do have agency ultimately over what ends up being talked about, what ends up in the canons, what ends up being preserved, the sort of books that end up in the libraries of architectural schools. So architectural history, like it or not, is consequential. And it has a long history of exclusion of subjects, of spaces, constituencies of people deemed, we might say, unworthy of its attention. So we might say that I'm an architectural historian queer, yes, but also queer by sensibility. And so I'm interested, let's say, in helping redress, face up to some of those historiographical injustices, which are informed by my own marginalized status, both as queer and someone that also grew up in a sort of in a working class background in the UK, and the elitist and socially exclusive makeup of architectural history might well explain why certain themes have been excluded that haven't really entered into scholarly awareness, like queerness and its spatial articulation. So our book helps, we hope, fill a lacuna in that historiography, but also in the market. And I understand it is actually available in town at the Het Nu, is it called that? Het Nu Institute, and whichever is your most famous flagship bookshop. I think they have some, that's true. So what am I going to do? So yeah, we're going to talk separately, because we thought that might be a nice way of doing it. So I'm going to start by talking about, if you like, the substantial foundations onto which we built this book. And one of those seminal moments happened in California in 1992 with the inauguration of a new course called, appropriately, Queer Space at UCLA's School of Architecture in Los Angeles. And they prepared a course syllabus aiming really to bring formulations of queer theory that were present in literary theory, film criticism, and history into the fields of architecture and planning. And then a couple of years later, on the left-hand side in New York City, an exhibition happened at the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York City, which was an organization really dedicated to promoting critical debate in architecture and urbanism, founded in 1982. And this exhibition was really about actually setting to try and define queer and space, and if you like, interrogating the conceptual bonds that unite them, thinking about, for example, how minorities define their rights to occupy spaces within the city, and whether such queer spaces can be given a legitimate history and a future. And I wasn't going to kind of provide a sort of literature review. Unless you'd like one. But I thought rather I'd start with this. And this is a quote, as you can see, and it should be in italics, how terrible of me, sorry, of Queer Spiritual Spaces, Sexuality and Sacred Places, published by Routledge in 2010. And the editor's think have the right idea. So I thought we'd start here. They say in their introduction, this book doesn't provide a definitive definition of queer spaces. So, reader, if you're an aspiring logical positivist, put this book down now before you get disappointed or enraged. And I think those among you that are in that category would give you a moment's pause to leave. And I think they have the right idea because I quite agree. Because to me, queer space really, to some extent, by its very nature, resists fixed definitions. And we've left it up, in our case, to our global authors, 55 of them no less, interdisciplinary authors, let's say academic historians, curators, filmmakers, architects, we've honored, let's say, their own definitions and conceptualizations of what constitutes queer space, thus we hope sensitive to a really wide range of experiences and cultural traditions. So perhaps I could speak rather than what queer spaces are, perhaps what they could be. So certainly to me they are vital ecosystems for the marginalized and frankly often oppressed. Certainly they can be permissible realms of self-expression and even self-love, and they can be sources of validation and homes from home. So the book really is an opportunity to notice and also to reimagine architecture's possibilities, and it's a profoundly revisionist, probing, I think often poetic set of stories of difference. And it's for those who are different and for those whose differences have meant that they've been ignored, frankly, from a, we might say, heterodox historiography. They haven't found their chroniclers, and we've got about 100, maybe 92, I always forget, spaces in the book that cater to really different parts of the LGBTQIA plus coalition. Right across time, at least certainly 1750 onwards, right across place, we hope. And it's important to say there are inevitable limitations in terms of what we can include. That goes without saying, and some of that is dependent on the strengths of our respective networks. In some cases, you know, of course, there are obvious ethical issues, those who depend on secrecy for their survival that can't be included. But single examples, generally speaking, speak for much broader phenomena, from queer archives to queer domesticities to sites of queer reappropriation. So let's go and look at some, and I'm going to start with landscape, let's say. I'm going to go to Sicily. I mean, it's a bit of a candy shop, so I've sort of just chosen some examples. Then turn to queer archives, and then I'm going to take you to a Georgian cottage in Wales, and then some working class spaces in industrial Sheffield, in the north of England, and then a Hijra Mars home in Dhaka, and then I'll also show you a couple of community centres as well. Where's the Homo monument? Is it on here?
Yes.
It'll come later. We'll show you later. Because there are a couple of Dutch spaces in the book as well. So I've decided to start with Taormina Island in Sicily, which has a really extraordinary, you can sort of see it, surviving ancient Greek theatre. And it's seen here, as I said, somewhat obliquely, and it's the setting for this photograph by the German expatriate photographer, Baron Wilhelm von Glöden. This is circa 1890 from the Paul Getty collection. And Taormina Island attracted increasing amounts of tourists from Northern Europe onwards from the 18th century grand tour, including many homosexual men seeking relative freedom from intrusion. And among the most famous of its expatriate residents was von Glöden, and he'd studied history and painting at Rostock in East Germany, and so he became very familiar with tropes, let's say, of homoeroticism in Greek art and life, and he was advised by doctors to go somewhere warm, probably because of tuberculosis, we're not sure, and he settled in Taormina in 1878, and photography became his hobby, or indeed his vocation, and he's well known, therefore, of this sort of corpus of homoerotic photographs of nude or semi-nude men, often in these sorts of mock classical costumes or pastoral settings, and often insinuating sexual availability. In short, it's a coded homosexuality in plain sight and these are two of those. And the photographic oeuvre, if you like, is a significant part of the homosexual legacy of antiquity in the Mediterranean. And Taormina itself then was a queer space for von Glurden. And von Glurden did have, for what it's worth, several intimate sexual relations, same-sex relations in the house on the island. But actually, the Mediterranean landscape itself, with its ancient architecture, is explored in our book as a setting of homoerotic fantasy, and we might say boyish beauty for generations of homosexual expatriates in 19th and 20th century Sicily. So that's the first example. And it also gives you really a sense of the different scales of the book, that a small thing actually can speak for something much, much bigger, which we tried to actually generate in our editorial capacities. Oh, there's the Homo monument. Now, I've made a couple of notes about it, so I'll go back to that. So the Homo monument, yeah, I've just put this here because it's the theme of landscape, and these rather radiant triangles might be familiar to many of you. They're Rosa Perino granite on the bank of, do we call it the Kaisersgracht Canal? Kaisersgracht? Okay, apparently not. I thought I was doing well. And it's designed by Karen Dahn, and I think this is the first time this post has actually been published. And, you know, it goes without saying, you know, it memorializes homosexual victims, of course, who were persecuted during Nazi occupation. So that's there, and then Café, I'm too scared to say it now, Café Temange or something like that. Well, how do you pronounce it, Adam? There's a cafe in Amsterdam that's included, which is another wonderful example. I can spell it to you. So as a segue, so I'm going to go and talk about archives, and then I won't talk for too long, of course. And I thought I'd mention a film as a way into this subject, a way of understanding one of the big themes of the book. And this is a sort of major, we might even say pioneering part of the historiography, indeed visual historiography, around queer spaces on which our work was built. And it's a 1996 film that some of you might know called Watermelon Woman by the Libyan-American filmmaker Cheryl Dunye. And it's a work of autofiction about the central protagonist's journey of documenting a life of an unsung black American lesbian actress from the 1930s known as Watermelon Woman. And the main character of the movie really just talks to subjects who might have remembered her. And a major source of the narrative drama is that of archives, right? So film clips, newsreels, etc., photographs become part of the storytelling. And the main character, hilariously and importantly, visits satirically what's called the Center for Lesbian Information and Technology, or CLIT, which is a parody of the Lesbian Her Story archives in New York City, or the LHA, founded in a brownstone in New York in 1974. And it was organized really as a domestic space in which lesbians and other queer people were encouraged to not just see, but essentially touch a lesbian, a queer legacy. So the LHA aimed for, let's say, a kind of emotional rather than a narrowly intellectual understanding or experience of the archive. And the LHA and its representation in this film point to the crucial role of archives within queer culture and to their often unorthodox and inventive forms. And it transpires critically at the end of the film, actually, that the Watermelon Woman herself was the filmmaker's own creation. So the implication is that these voices need representation, even if you actually have to invent it yourself. And in our book, we couldn't include many of the pioneering queer archives that are out there, including the LHA, which is absent. But we tried to give a broader sense of them, a handful of archives that we think have, you know, commonalities that constitute a profound response to that ongoing challenge of queer representation, acts of radical recovery for finding missing voices, you know, profoundly absent voices, we might say, and absent feelings. Another one of the archives, I'm going to mention three that we've included, is the One Institute for Homophile Studies, and I believe it's the oldest established LGBTQ organization in the US and the largest archive of LGBTQ materials in the world. And furthermore, it was the first advanced educational institution in that country to offer master's and also doctoral degrees in homophile studies, and one of the first LGBT organizations to really have its own office. So it essentially acted as a queer community center. And the photo left or on the right shows the institute's, no, the photo on the left shows the institute's, so this is Venice Boulevard Library in 1953, and the one on the right is the one founder himself, Jim Kepner, on the left-hand side, and W. Dorr Legg standing outside the same building. And so, like many buildings of this kind, it was difficult for the Institute, this is very common actually for queer spaces, it was difficult for them to find a permanent and suitable building. So the One Institute began in a series of small spaces in Los Angeles, including a downtown store, I think in the Pico Union district. And then for some time it was even in an archive location on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and it's now housed in West Hollywood in a gallery, but there's a separate archive as well in USC's library. And then another example, so I wanted to mention other archives profiled in the book, and this is perhaps for contrast as much as for commonality. This is the Trans Memory Archive in Buenos Aires, and it's a project really of documenting the very existence of Argentine travesty trans people for posterity. And what they did was they used a closed Facebook group. These are members of the trans community across Argentina, but especially in Buenos Aires, and they uploaded personal photographs, often print photographs from photo albums, and they shared anecdotes that spanned decades to essentially find each other again. And as the project got bigger, a small team actually commissioned, or well, it was really community, but also professional photographers got together and they began digitizing these photographs from the past, scanning them in high resolution to essentially preserve trans memory, and there were also letters and other ephemera. So they were reclaiming a hitherto simply unchronicled heritage. And I've written down the words of Facundo Revuelta, who very empathetically writes the vignette in the book. And he's put it quite profoundly. He said, quote, "Interrupted by exclusion and violence, many things from the past were lost, as documenting life was so difficult when existence itself took up all of one's energy." So this here is another example. This is the Museum of Transology, which is held actually at the Bishopsgate Institute, just opposite Liverpool Station, in a weirdly queer-looking building from circa 1905 by, what's Townsend's first name, do you remember? Francis Townsend, I think. Weirdly queer, lots of sort of gold. In that arts and crafts sort of Art Nouveau way. And so it's another kind of archive of feeling, if you like. It's, as I said, part of that bigger collection at the Bishopsgate Institute, which is the most significant collection in this case of material culture surrounding trans, but also non-binary and intersex lives. And this is just one of the many artifacts, and I had the joy of taking students there recently with Adam, in fact, to look at some of these objects. And this is just a lipstick, and it's not brandished with a designer logo. For those that know England, it might well have come from Boots or Savers rather than from the Dior counter at Liberty. It's that lipstick that you find at the bottom, many of you might be familiar with, at the bottom of your handbag that gets a bit dirty. And the tag critically is written by the donors themselves. Okay, they're never corrected in any way, but it tells us that it was the present from a sister who was the first family member to accept her siblings' gender transition. So this ordinary object, seemingly ordinary object, becomes no less than absolutely extraordinary. And then I thought I'd mention a couple of community centres. So on the left is the Black Lesbian and Gay Centre, the late great Black Lesbian and Gay Centre, and then on the right is the Victorian Pride Centre in Melbourne. And the reasons for that juxtaposition will be revealed momentarily. In my case, I know the Peckham area very well. This is in South London. Both are included in our book. And perhaps let's start with the one on the left. This was a really important centre for queer identifying black people in southeast London and beyond, in fact, founded in the 1980s. And again, the organisation really struggled to find a physical space that was permanent, mostly because of discriminatory landlords. And it acted as a very important community centre in spite of those obstacles, and they managed to form coalitions with unions and community groups, rallying thousands to protest against a rise at that time in anti-gay sentiments. And they eventually found a tiny office under the railway arches in Peckham Rye, as I said, in southeast London, a Victorian railway arch in the early 1990s. And this is, for example, the newsletter that was published. So we tried to kind of reclaim all different kinds of media in the book. It's not all sort of gorgeously crisp images from, you know, the British architectural collections. It's these self-made newsletters are just as interesting in some ways. So the centre closed in 1999. In fact, it moved briefly to a small volunteer-run office. But when it closed, a volunteer moved the helpline. There was a very important helpline. They moved it, they redirected it to their own home, and that phone line continued to ring for almost a decade. So it speaks to the significance of this community centre. And let's compare that, shall we, with the sort of new and shiny Victorian Pride Centre that opened in 2021, designed by Brearley architects and urbanists and Grant Ammon architects. Which covers 6,200 metres squared of office space, combining many LGBT organisations and also social spaces for them. And that's among the newest of the spaces profiled in our book. So that's one typology that I think is perhaps quite interesting in juxtaposition. So I thought we might, as I promised, and I keep to my promises, we might go to Georgian Wales. So off we go. So this is Plas Newydd in Clwyd, in 18th century North Wales. And it's the cottage of the famous Ladies of Llangollen. And if there are Welsh people in the audience, now's the time to correct me. No, so let's go with it. The Ladies of Llangollen. So this is a kind of idiosyncratic Gothic with a K. We can debate why there's a K over drinks if you want. It's a Gothic spectacle. It's the home of these two ladies, Eleanor Butler and Sarah Ponsonby, who, having eloped from Ireland, they were of aristocratic breed, if you like, they settled here in 1779, and it was really their shared haven for about half a century. And they essentially rejected the impositions of patriarchal domestic arrangements, and they built this new life of rural retirement, but also self-improvement here together. And in their time, and I've looked into this, they were the subject of enormous conversation and gossip, and much of that gossip was quite uncryptic, really, in its implication that Butler and Ponsonby were lesbians, as we'd now understand that term. But the situating of the ladies has often employed the term romantic friendship, so capital R, capital F, and this describes the nature of their relationship, which was simply a form of passion between two women. And as I understand it, in the late 18th and early 19th century, it was generally held that respectable women were without sexual passion, so romantic friendships of this kind could actually find a degree of cultural acceptability. Interestingly, the term romantic friendship is also kind of synonymous with things like self-improvement, with gardening, with a passion for the Gothic. And it was also a spiritual kind of intimacy that hadn't necessarily to do with eroticism. It hadn't necessarily to do with whether or not they did it, although inevitably they did. And moreover, the term relates quite invariably, this is the critical point, to middle class and upper class experiences, which reflect the material possibilities, also the types of records, frankly, that survive, that enable this kind of lifestyle to have been documented. And the evidence, so further to correspondence, is things like recipe books, private papers, poetry, diaries. All of this survives, forms of communication that were actually only available to educated and literate men and women. So the type of evidence privileges middle and upper class people, especially those with something of a public profile, making it simply more likely that this stuff is going to survive for posterity to be found by historians. And then conversely to Plas Newydd, and the famous ladies, the structures, as I've tried to explain, of a sort of elitist patriarchal society in Britain made it much rarer for the historian to be able to retrieve the stories of working class men and women, queer voices, even more silenced than those elite gay voices. And it's too often believed, in fact, that queer lives could only exist in the upper and middle classes, but they actually flourished, interestingly, perhaps sometimes actually more openly and powerfully. It's very nuanced, of course, in the working class culture of 19th and 20th century industrial England. And this is the subject of 3 vignettes in our book. And I've put this image of the arc furnace here in Sheffield's famous, sadly now extinct, steelworking industry. Steelworking district from 1949 on the left-hand side, and on the right is a photo of a fishing trip that was made with the steelworkers, and it was reported that several of them openly had same-sex sex on the bus. And here and elsewhere, and there's also a pub on the site called the Norfolk Arms, working class men, and this is proven, conducted same-sex relationships largely free from intrusion and judgment. And then this slide, on the right-hand side, I've put a prosecution file from 1950, which is also known as a buggery file, in fact, at the time. And this is one of those sort of key sources that historians have been able to use, we might say reappropriate, in order to find, to locate, in this case, cis men, desiring cis men in the industrial north of England at a certain time. And this is Helen Smith's work, who is a historian at Lincoln University. And of those, she found in this case that a typical 2-up, 2-down terrace house, like the ones on left, this is the Midland Road in Sheffield, for those that know Sheffield, this typical kind of 2-up, 2-down terraced house was the home of a man that she calls G, because G appears in the buggery file, and that's one of the protagonists of her story. And she poignantly said that, quote, working class, queer domestic spaces don't carry blue plaques. They hide in plain sight, like many of the men who lived in them. And so for every man like G who was arrested, right, many others lived queer lives in streets just like this one. So queerness is all around us. So we've sought to examine, as I've said, queer spaces throughout time and also social strata. But we also sought to move away from binaries. So this includes, for instance, spaces belonging to in our book, I'm talking about South Asian, specifically Bangladeshi Hijra community, and also in our book, Latin American Argentine travesty community. And these are gender and sexual identities that really transgress the dominant Western dichotomy of female, male, woman, man. And I should add that these areas are, they're outside my expertise, but I've chosen to mention a Hijra Guru Ma's rooftop in the old town of Dhaka in Bangladesh, and this photograph comes from our book and shows a Hijra performing in this really vibrant outdoor space. Self-presenting as neither man nor woman, the Hijra lie outside normative systems of caste, of class, let's say, of religion, also reproduction, in fact, and often live marginalized lives on the fringes of society. And they necessarily come together to create an alternative, often, as you can see here, extremely vibrant alternative model of kinship, queer kinship, we might say, finding sanctuary in the care of Hijra Guru Ma, who is essentially the mother of the house. And the author of this text in our book was Ruhul Abdin, and he wrote, I'm just going to quote what he said, in a city like Dhaka, for trans bodies and Hijra members, access to a genuine safe place is profoundly important. So really that's all I wanted to say. I just sort of hope that these spaces are as empowering to you as they've been and as they are to us. Would you like to do your bit? Yeah.
Joshua works across temporalities and geography. No, this is not my presentation. Thanks, Josh. I've seen that presentation multiple times, and it's an absolute joy every time because he remembers all the names and the dates, and I just don't understand how you do it. But it's great to see. I guess that's what you get from doing a PhD in architectural history. So yeah, I'm a Londoner, and this is I mention this because it's kind of fun. It's sort of fundamental to my entire identity, and I guess the trajectory in my life that led towards the book, which is something that I'm just going to go through now because it sort of underlines and explains the passion on my end, and Josh has his other personal reasons that kind of gave jet fuel to his passion that sort of made a book like this happen in the context of the Royal Institute of British Architects, which it wasn't in. There was some interest there, but there was quite a lot of I guess energy involved in making it happen in an organization of that size with that much bureaucratic inertia and misunderstanding of the issue. So I was brought up in the 1990s in London, and that was very much defined as a queer teenager by something called Section 28, which was brought into the statute book by Margaret Thatcher in 1987. I think it was 97 and 98. And it's become a model for many other forms of legislation in other countries, homophobic legislations in other parts of the world, including Putin's legislation in 2008. It was against the promotion of homosexuality, and actually there's a new piece of legislation that was just brought in by the governor of Florida called the Don't Say Gay bill, which is sort of based upon this. And it created a very hostile environment for queer children who were growing up within schools, because the entire discussion or mentioning of the issue or the existence of gay people, queer people, non-binary, gender, non-conforming people was not allowed. And the consequences of that were something that happened to me, but also happened to other people that I knew of the same generation. It actually happened to a kid who was down the road in a school very nearby, which was I was outed / came out at the age of 15 in 97, something like that, in my North London school. And the bullying rapidly became so bad that I could not go through the school without being physically protected by others. If there was basically only one student who would protect me, or staff members. And that bullying became so severe, but it was never mentioned. So the word gay was never mentioned. The issue of why the bullying happened was never mentioned. And I was asked to not attend the school anymore because I was causing these children to be so aggressive. So it was, and this exactly the same thing happened to a kid a kilometer down the road in another school, very different school, exactly the same outcome. Actually, for him, it was worse because I think for the period before he was asked to leave, he had to stay in the staff room and couldn't go into the rest of the school as well. So I was out of school during my A-levels in London. And this is why London is so important to me, because if I was in any other city or town, I would have fallen through the cracks. There wouldn't have been a community to have been found that would tell me that I wasn't wrong, that would tell me that I wasn't disgusting, that would tell me that it wasn't my fault that I was being beaten up, that it wasn't my fault that there were kids who were chasing me down the street because basically all of North London knew that I was one of those batty boys. It wasn't my fault that I was thrown off buses by other people who were on those buses. It wasn't my fault that every time I tried to go into a pub with people who were supposed to be my friends, I would be chased out by someone with a knife. That was other people. And that was through the discovery of a queer space in my area, a gay pub, which is a kind of old British institution where there was a normal old-looking pub that from the outside was really, didn't stand out, wasn't shocking, but you would go inside and there were elder queers, there were younger queers, there were gays, and they took me on. I studied for my A-levels. I only got one, but I mean, I did study for my A-levels, and they didn't allow me to drink, but I had a table by the kitchen. I would help them, make some food, and they would give me tea. I studied, and I was introduced to the gay scene. I was introduced to Soho, which was a very vibrant and lively architectural, interior design, music, graphic design, political scene. There was a lot of hedonism, there was a lot of money. The queer scene, the gay scene had never been more successful than it was at the time. It was wealthy, but it was also politically extremely kind of pointed and active. So Section 28 was still in the statute book. The environment was horrible for queer kids. The age of consent was 21, so basically all of the people that I knew around our age we could be thrown into prison for what we were doing, a lot at the time, with people who were not 21. But then there was also a lot of violence. So, I mean, there were not a lot of bombings, but for instance, the most extreme thing that happened was I was down the road. Everyone was around at the time. It was a very busy period. There was the bomb at the Admiral Duncan, which killed 3 people. It severely injured and maimed many others, including a friend of mine's father. So there was a scene that was extremely lively that I was part of. It was exuberant. It had money. It was expressing itself in ways that hadn't happened before. So there were interior designs of bars, nightclubs, restaurants, cafes that were constantly being produced that were exuberant and expressive of identity through visual culture. But this was also tied to political expression through protest signs and protest movements and protest graphics, which were tied into the graphics and the interiors of nightclubs. And I was very, very lucky to be a sort of artistic kid at the time and was involved in some of this because there was plenty of work to go round. So I was kind of forged, you know, you can't help but be forged by that kind of environment. Like, it turns you into a particular type of character who, if I may say, doesn't take a lot of shit. And then I went to this environment, so it was just all shit. So one of my first, I ended up at the AA because basically I didn't have enough A-levels to actually go into a normal university, and the AA sort of, if you got a bit of cash, you can get in. And they sort of let me in. Thanks, Mum and Dad. And I'd always wanted to be an architect, but one of the first things I came across was, like, for instance, Patrick Schumacher in DRL, which everyone was saying, you got to go. There's this genius. It's this research group that's doing the future. It's amazing. It's computers. It's like the Matrix. And then you go in. It's just, and you're sort of going in. It is a little bit like the Matrix because there's like bodies on the corridor. There's like crying students in black suits. On the floor, and then you walk in and there's just this silence and this stuffy atmosphere and just depression, and Patrick's just using lots of big words one after another that mean nothing, and then students sort of prostrating themselves like, I don't understand you. That's because he's not saying anything, he's just stringing words together. Anyway, so there was this kind of very much a culture of obeisance, of sort of prostrating yourself in front of these great thinkers who were using lots and lots of opaque language that didn't mean anything, telling people that particular aesthetic, using particular technology, was the future. This is what is good. This is serious architecture. You have to draw lots of complicated drawings that look like alien squid, and you have to make models that look like Spider-Man's webs but painted black. And I kind of obviously was like, what? And I was, as my boyfriend now, who's this wonderful, lovely Milanese person, says I used to sort of dress like sort of prostitute from a movie. I think I was sort of very colourful character there. And I was like, where is the opportunity? I want to represent my identity. I want to talk about my community. I want to talk about my background. I want to do all the graphic work. I want to do protest stuff. Like, where is this in the architecture? How can I do this? And you couldn't. Like, there was either the sort of Patrick stuff, and this changes every generation. There's a kind of different set of things which you're allowed to do, or which are considered serious architecture. But at the time in the AA, it was either that, or this kind of sort of, let's wank over concrete, sort of like, oh, the shadows, Kenneth Frampton, or like, oh, the things, the eyes in my hands. And so it was like either one of those. And there was definitely no space for these questions of representation or identity and politics embodied through visual culture. And that's the thing I emphasize. I come at the book as a designer who likes history, but as a designer. And so there was a process of coming out again. So there was a kind of traumatic process of coming out, which was physically very violent. And very, very uprooting in all kinds of ways. As a teenager, in architecture school, it wasn't violent, although I experienced a tiny bit of violence in Rotterdam in the architectural context. But it was just sort of, coming across people who were just absolutely not interested in listening at anything to do with that topic. So there was a kind of process over the next 5 years of coming out again, and where I've been sort of very able to argue my case for my existence with the help of a lot of the queer elders. As a teenager, in architecture school, it was quite a solitary thing. But being sort of, the dog with the bone that I am, I sort of wouldn't let go, and ended up going through the AA, producing work that was possibly sort of more extreme, So more a sort of, more me than it would have been if there had been a really sort of welcoming environment. So I ended up producing work that I look back on now and it's just like kind of too much. I mean, this is just the visuals, but also, you know, there was a lot of extremely punchy content there, and that was produced, and now I look back at the time, in a sort of very sort of very discursive, aggressive environment that at the time I actually think brought out the best in me in many ways. And that in the school, I think there was a lot of other people. I mean, so for instance, in my first unit where I started, almost all of the men were sort of gay. We all sort of ended up in the same space. Almost every one of those have left the profession, or left they actually, most of them left before the degree was finished, and a lot of them left after the end of architecture school, because there is a situation where you could kind of be gay outside the university, but you couldn't really express yourself through your work. And I'll get into that later on. And coming out happened a third time. So there was a kind of 5-year process of coming out with kind of lots of things that I learned about sort of queer methodologies and ways of sort of code switching, ways of camouflaging oneself to sort of be indestructible in a way by ticking the boxes of the current sort of paradigms, but then slipping in like sugar with a medicine, lots of gayness. But the same thing happened in the professional context of the architectural world of London, which is a very, very sort of middle-class, heteronormative, biscuit tea, worthy, boring environment. And there wasn't place, again, for any of these things. So I had friends who were working in gay performance. There were people who were working in events, people working in what are these things, the big things called, like festivals, in festivals, and doing a lot of really interesting work that I really liked. But I wanted absolutely to be in the architecture scene. Like, I wanted to be seen in the architecture scene. I wanted to be involved in architectural discourse. I wanted to be taken seriously. So I was like, I'm not going to give up and go into a parallel field. And there was nobody that I could find in my entire generation, which is kind of very, it's like if you think about it, like my generation, I'm the age of Assemble. So that's the kind of, those are the peers that I had. So there wasn't really people that I could find wanting to be interested in those sorts of topics. But I was lucky enough while working in practices in London to get a couple of commissions or residencies which allowed me to explore some of these issues. The first was the Design Museum Design and Residence program in 2013, where I produced a project called Identity Parade. And that was something where I took one of the issues that we're very kind of obsessed with at the time. I mean, at the moment, everyone in the UK is talking about embodied carbon and sustainability. Back then, people were really obsessed with technology, manufacturing technology, fabrication. Everything was about fab labs and 3D printing. And as my father said, he's like, we were 3D printing in engineering in the 1970s. So he didn't understand why everyone was so excited, but everyone was. And so I took this kind of, you know, the interest in these, and I framed a sort of very queer project in those terms to the Design Museum, and ended up producing a project over 3 months, which was about a designer who, through fiction, and fiction has been very important, just like with the Watermelon Woman, as a way of me constructing a space to be able to do these projects, which justifies itself, where a kind of fictional character lived for 3 months in their home, like a Japanese hikikomori, and lived their lives through social media. Grindr, Instagram, Facebook, all the anxieties, all the worries, all the kind of strange things that happen when you're living a sort of online life. But every single day they would produce an object, and that object was separate to economic or financial needs. It was separate to clients. So these objects, which were made by 3D printing, by laser cutting, by things that could be delivered to the door, were separated from all the usual kind of parameters of design. And they were just only about identity. And this is only about a third of them, because this was a second showing. The Design Museum had a much bigger space. And I basically turned into this character over about 3 months. And all of these objects together collectively became this person's identity. They were a way of expressing the complexity of their entire lifespan, non-narratively, through objects which were expressively showing in visual cultural manners, through color, through pattern, through ornament, through decoration, through form, the complexity of someone's background, identity, lifestyle, and stories. And each one of these objects, yes, they did have a full story, which were written up and published online. So there's a kind of narrative behind them, but then they turn into sort of queer, eloquent objects on their own. And that led to the UK Rome Prize for Architecture in Rome the year afterwards, where I took that principle, but then scaled it up to the urban well, increased it to the urban scale. And that was a project where I basically did a queer grand tour. That's where I met Wouter. Yes, Wouter gave an amazing lecture, which was very, very nice to free the stuffy air of the British Academy when I was there. And it was basically a project where I went to the city and found a lot of different alternative historiography of my own of the city, which was very helpful that there was a lot of architectural historians and archaeologists sitting at dinner every day who could send me off in a direction. But each one of these stories, which kind of looked at it's not just queer, but queer in the sense of things which are very different, unusual, ignored within the normal historiography of Rome. But looking at, this is one example, Henrik Christian Andersen, he has a huge museum in Rome. It's kind of slightly ignored. He was a gay sculptor, Norwegian sculptor, who was very wealthy because of a mine that his parents owned. He was Henry James's lover, who visited him regularly, and his workshop and his production of absolutely hideous sculptures. I mean, like, you know, just very muscly men holding babies. I mean, that's like literally just like there's one with like a giant sort of Hercules like this, you know, an Aryan man with a sort of big willy holding up like 7 babies in one hand. It's just really weird. But he was actually he was hugely influential, and he's totally ignored. He was hugely influential on the kind of the sculptural taste, for instance, of Foro Italico, so Mussolini's Olympic sports area, which was built just north of where the museum was at the time. And also he came up with a sort of imaginary city, which he worked up, and because he was very wealthy, worked up in great detail with a lot of huge models and drawings. And it was an imaginary city on the site of where Fiumicino is now at the moment, the airport in the south of Rome. And that was actually the spark of the idea which began discussions in fascist circles for the construction of Eur. Because he held many soirees for politically important people at the time to try and convince them to build this imaginary city. So there are a lot of actually really interesting stories which do actually dovetail into real important urban history of Rome that are just not covered. And each one of these, again, so it's this mixing of design, fiction, historical fact, and uncovering, for me, that's really important. And each one of these were turned into an animation, a series of architectural designs, as well as a story. And these were published every 2 weeks on the Architectural Review's website in London. This is the story of Valentino's fight with McDonald's, which should be more documented. It's very interesting. It's the Battle of the Reds of Rome. And again, each one of these, all of this complexity, the kind of stories, which this book is so full of, are turned into objects which I guess are easily ridiculed and dismissed. So kind of evocative, I guess kind of sexy, easy, consumable souvenirs. Objects of delight. And this is something that runs through almost all of queer history, the kind of eloquence, the silent eloquence of objects and the meaning that they hold. So it's kind of like the creation of little queer archives that mean that all of the background stories and kind of information that went into them is embedded in them, but is not overweighing them with narrative didacticism. And so after those projects, I sort of went out and was very much trying to produce work that was, as I see it, my interest is in kind of the queer aesthetics, or being queer through design in visual culture. That's an interest to me, and that's something that absolutely does not have place in architecture. You can, in architecture school, not when I was studying, but you can do your history and theories on queer studies. You can write an essay on queerness, but it's a very different thing to be able to design queerly. If you go to an office, you can be gay in London, you can have a husband, you can be lesbian, you can have a wife, you can be gender non-conforming, as long as it doesn't come into your work, right? Your work just has to look like Caruso St. John, but cheaper. And you have to erase yourself, basically, your identity in the work. So it's a little bit like the architectural equivalent of, I don't mind those gays, but I wish they weren't so loud about it. You know, if they just do it in their living room, it would be okay. It's that kind of 1990s attitude where they're sort of kind of okay with it, but actually really uncomfortable with it. And so I've been sort of campaigning and writing to try and argue for the space for difference to be very visually present within architectural culture, in the urban landscape and on the streets themselves, not just once a year at Pride or in terms of ethnic diversity, once a year with the Notting Hill Carnival. This is an article that I wrote that sort of ended up going sort of a little bit viral. This is another article, you can read these online, this is another article I wrote very often about the kind of duplicity, right, the Janus-faced hypocrisy of architecture that presents itself as oh so progressive, but actually is everything but, you know, all the way from the way that it treats its employees through to, you know, into financially and in working conditions, but also all the way through to how it allows them to express themselves through their work. And this is something that I try and, am I going too long? Okay, I'll go a little bit quicker. But this is the kind of thing also that I try and argue my point through architectural examples. So from a while ago when I was invited to propose a new type of civic architecture for the UK, this is for the Architecture Fringe up in Scotland, this is a project where I was talking about how we could try and create architectures which are materially embodying difference through permanent architecture, artwork, material culture, which is created in the local area by different artists, creating a sense of location and place that is permanent, rather than, because there's a kind of dogma of pop-up activism or pop-up diversity, where you use a fleeting moment to indicate, like corporate social responsibility, where you sort of put a black person or in the photo of your very white practice, that's the kind of urban equivalent when people have events or they project something onto the building once a year. So there's a kind of argument that civic architecture could be a framework for the embodiment of difference in material culture visually and permanently over time. This is, I received quite a lot of flack because I obviously design these things, they're not real. So people basically see it and think I'm just proposing that I design everything. But actually, if you read the text, this is talking about sort of time-based frameworks for diverse architecture. But I love designing, so, you know, I do design. This is my proposal for an extension to the British Library, which is obviously going to happen, and I bet Prince Charles will, King, oh my God, King Charles, I'm never going to be able to build anything in the UK, am I? Will absolutely love it, won't he? Well, I guess it's kind of, yeah, anyway. And I've had some opportunities to sort of start doing this in real life, bit by bit. As you can imagine, you know, without a sort of network like Assemble had of like-minded people with good connections, all doing a similar thing, it's sort of a little bit harder to slowly come across clients who are willing to take a risk and to produce these things also in the absence of critical acclaim, because the critics are all from a sort of similar group that celebrate a particular type of architecture, but bit by bit, like that project in King's Cross, which was a few years ago, Gateways, which was a series of ceramic, which was a series of ceramic arches in King's Cross, to a project, this is a collaboration with Sibling Architecture in Melbourne. This was the entrance cafe ticketing space to the Melbourne Triennial, which was a project of gender fucking in every way. So it's actually kind of quite a sort of didactic look at gender fucking, where we spent about 6 months sort of looking at how we could do that through color, through two-dimensional ornamentation, three-dimensional form, and spatial organization. This was actually very busy because there were 1.5 million people went through this, but they only took photos before people went in, which is just great. So that's Sibling Architecture who's sitting there trying to make it look lively. But one of my favorite moments ever was every single night there'd be a drag performance on it. And so I had a video of this wonderful Australian Vietnamese drag performer who sort of draped over those steps with disco lights, singing Kylie's I Should Be So Lucky, and I don't think I've ever been so happy. I was like, this is what I want my work to be like. And so this kind of culminates in queer spaces, because if I go right back to the beginning, not the beginning, but if I go back to architecture school, to those gay friends who were in my unit at the very beginning, only one of whom is still practicing architecture, we were all uniformly, we were ridiculed. So we were humiliated and ridiculed. And actually my very, very first experience of a crit or a criticism in architecture school was we were brought to our unit space and we were asked to show any work that we'd done before. And a friend of mine brought out a project, and it was amazing. You know, it was this basically just like utterly camp, over-the-top gay archway. There's a theme here of archways, in a place where politically actually it would have been very interesting. Like there's a lot of questions that were raised by the fact that where this was proposed. And he was absolutely torn to pieces, torn to pieces. Now I look back with no good reason, but humiliated, ridiculed in a way that was meant to haze. I don't know if you guys know, it's an American saying, haze. When you go to university, you get humiliated by your peers so that you're part of the group. So basically, it's a way of like breaking a horse. You strip away your personality so that you become one of them. And there's kind of a form of architectural hazing, and kind of architectural crits have that sort of tendency, because if you listen very hard, there isn't a lot of real substantive intellectual foundation to the way things are judged. It's just a form of hazing. And it was basically telling us, don't do anything like that ever again, God forbid. And we didn't. And he didn't. And that went on all the way through university. Everything was either just ridiculed as, oh, that's pomo rubbish, or why are you talking, is that about sex? It's just, why are you talking about that? So everything was kind of pushed away. And part of this, looking back was, or a very large part of it, was a lack of references. So in architecture school, for instance, you'd have someone who would put up, like literally a scribble, right? Just like a piece of rubbish. And he'd be like, oh, Japanese darkness. And all of the tutors would go, oh, in praise of darkness. I've read that. Let's talk about it. And so the shared reference would become the foundation of taking the work seriously, the ideas behind the work seriously. And this was the case across the board. And it's a natural human kind of inclination, right? We need to know that something has been validated by people we recognize as being important. Wikipedia operates in a similar way. You can't put something up, and actually hopefully this will help with that in queer spaces, but you can't put something up unless it's been validated by being published in something of repute, a publication of repute, I think is what they say. And the other gay students and myself would be producing work, but we didn't have any of that. And if we did have references, they weren't validated in the architectural circles, and they absolutely weren't taken seriously. They were just simply not considered. So most people gave up because they were just being ritually humiliated every time they would present something. Me, like a dog with a bone, also, unfortunately, I was the kind of character who was literally used to, if someone was beating me up, I would say exactly what would make them beat me up more until they would stop. So I was kind of used to taking the beating. And I unfortunately have felt very comfortable in that position. And actually, I'm now, during COVID, was looking back a bit, and I'm like, I kind of maybe put myself a bit too often in that position. But I was very comfortable to take that. And I didn't have references that were validated, but I had those that I used myself. And looking back, I wanted a book like this, and I know that if there had been a book like this validated by the Royal Institute of British Architects, or the AIA, or sort of an important body that was full of references of different types of queer spaces for many different types of architectural projects an architecture student might want to do, there would always be one space that they could use as a reference that could be their Japanese darkness, or in this case, Cuban ice cream store, to justify their work. And I know that my friends would have been able to get through. And I know that the tutors, who, by the way, most of the time, they don't mean bad, right? This is not deep homophobia that's knowingly done. It's just part of a culture. And if the tutors had seen things which they respected, that the students would have been able to do those projects, and they wouldn't have left the profession. So this is hugely meaningful. Anyway, so just to give a couple of the examples that I really particularly like, is Coppelia, and it's also looking at architecture in a different way. So it's not formal, it's social, but in a very different way than looking at particular social groups and helping communities. So a lot of queer spaces fall between the gaps of what architecture tutors think is really important. Coppelia is one of our examples of reappropriated patriarchal symbology. No, it's not really symbolism. Yeah, symbols. It's the world's biggest ice cream store, and it was built by Castro's regime in the 1960s in the sort of Pier Luigi Nervi inspired style. Because Castro had been to America and Canada and had seen ice cream and was absolutely taken with it as a symbol of excess and luxury. And he wanted to provide ice cream to the masses in a way that was more luxurious, more wonderful, more spectacular than anything that was provided by capitalism. So invested a huge amount in building this absolutely stunning and beautiful domed ice cream space that I think had how many flavors? You're really good at remembering numbers. like 27 flavors. Oh, it's less than Baskin Robbins, but anyway, so lots of flavors. It's right in the center, it's still there, it's right in the center of Havana, in a symbolically important place next to several government ministries. Huge amounts of money were lavished on it. And it was at the time, it was finished at the time that homosexuality, buggery, we recognize this from the UK, was illegal. Not only was it illegal, but there was a very severe clampdown where homosexuals were actively put into concentration camps along with Jews. It's a nice pairing that seems to go together quite a lot. But at the same time as this, those who weren't thrown into concentration camps were meeting up and hanging out and hooking up and having sex in Coppelia. So this symbol of the regime's luxury became the cruising ground for the whole of Cuba, with all of the different colored ice creams coming to represent all of the different nuances and shades of sexual desire between different types of men. So you'd have lots of people walking around with different colored ice creams and then heading off for their, what red and black meant together. I don't want to think about what that might mean, but and still to this day, the regime has apologized for what happened back then, but it's one of the only places in Havana with free Wi-Fi, and actually is a center for people going to meet each other on Grindr to this day. So it's kind of it's not misuse, it's actually a kind of reappropriation of a very important symbolic representation of an oppressive regime. And this is a type of space that I think we have 3 of represented, but there are many, many others around the world, and that's something that the book has. We always have every type of genre of space represented, but then the reader can go on and find many other examples of that. Alan Boosbaum, this is his studio in the 1970s in New York, a very important interior designer, famously designed Bette Midler's Soho apartment in the late 70s. He sort of completely and radically reinvented the notion of privacy within contemporary interior design. This was his office and his studio flat, where there was his bedroom and then steps up where you could see the bathtub. And then above that was the working space for all of the staff and the meeting rooms. And the staff were known to quite regularly bathe together naked. And apparently there was a saying in the office where you can't really know if you can trust a client until you've been naked with him in a bath. And that the kind of breaking down of privacy boundaries, which became so fashionable in the 1990s, as well as the use of ceramics, colorful ceramics, in postmodern architecture. And actually, these are both themes within a certain sort of genre of postmodern architecture. These were tropes taken from Boosbaum's genre, but he was never acknowledged for. For instance, the kind of colorful ceramics, which is so important to his interior design language, came from the bathhouses of New York, which he frequented, which were all covered in ceramics for hygiene reasons, but became in the 1950s, 1960s and onwards the places for homosexuals to meet, because nightclubs limited the amount of men that could go into them. So a lot of meetings would happen in the bathhouses. Now that is a sort of hidden background to postmodern design that I bet Ettore Sottsass never talked about. A really great example to show you the kind of range, because I think people unfortunately see me as in London, some people sort of are horrified that I'm some sort of cartoon character of a gay person, it's all colorful and whatever, and they think that the book is just going to be full of things that are very colorful, and it's not the case. This is very much a kind of attempt at a broad spread, a smorgasbord across the world, throughout time, across classes, of many, many different approaches to queer space. One of them being this house in Chiba in Japan, which is called the Light Coffin, or not the Dragon's Den. No, that's Dragon's Den is the TV show. Dracula's Den. Yeah, Dracula's Den. Of course, and we all know about the kind of homosexual connotations and underpinnings of the story of vampires. But the 1990s in Japan was actually kind of it was known as like a gay golden period. So the homosexual community had never been so visible in Japan in public media as they were at the time. But this wasn't all good. There's a kind of strong pressure that is very often referred to as homonormativity. The idea the pressure to conform to a certain type of queer or homosexual identity presentation. And actually the individuals who commissioned this house, an artist and a barber, were horrified at the pressure to conform to a particular notion of homosexuality, which was actually happening in the UK at the same time. This sort of, this sort of cartoon version of the colourful character on television who was neutralised and not scary because they would conform to a particular type of kind of innuendo-based colourful homosexuality where everything would turn into a joke about, ew, darling, you're talking about penises. Like everything sort of would become an innuendo about a penis. And these people desperately wanted to escape that. So they asked for the very opposite, the thing that was furthest away from all of the kind of ideas of over-presentation, of theatricality, of externalization of identity that was represented by what was popular at the time in Japan. And they created this place that had no windows, none. They actually didn't even want a skylight, but planning law meant that even a barn had to have a skylight. And there's no rooms. The bathroom is open. They would basically move around nomadically in the space in a way that allowed them to be totally free from all expectation. So those are kind of few examples that between me and Josh show you the kind of spread, the historical range, the architectural range, the social range, the lifestyle range that are encompassed with the book. And just to say that the kind of intent that we had in terms of opening up architectural production to people who want to express their queerness through design, we feel like it started happening because almost on a weekly basis we get photographs, DMs of students, or well, either students or from tutors whose students have done this, who have this book open on their presentation tables with post-it notes or whatever on them, using this as justification for the projects that they're producing. And that brings us endless joy. So thank you very much.
I'm sure you have plenty of questions for Josh and Adam. So who can I... Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's coming.
I have a few, actually, but I'll start with the first. I just first wanted to say something. I wrote it down. A friend of mine once told me that who also studies at TU Delft, where I study also architecture, and he told me that once the loudness of the color of his design was a reason to fail his assignment and therefore his subject. And I just wanted to mention this because means he could also not even finish his bachelor degrees because of the BSA, which is a Dutch requirement to go on with your studies. That was the tutor that did that. That is now the coordinator of the master track of architecture of TU Delft. That's Peter Korstra.
Can I just say that's precisely the kind of thing that happened to my friends?
Yeah.
So if that happened to me, I would literally raise hell. Like I would like the institution would burn.
Yeah.
But
really,
but not everyone should have to be like that.
No, exactly. But I wanted to say that because I was like, I hate that guy. I know he's pretty important, but it's frustrating that is a person that is leading the education of like the most important architecture studies in the Netherlands. You know, it's frustrating. Then my question. In my bachelor's of architecture now, I'm really doubting to go on, or I was doubting. And just give me 1 second. And I was just wondering, how do you kind of cope with, or do you have a strategy to get rid of the negativity of all the stuff? Because I can really get that, make that get to me. I was just wondering. That was my first question, and then I had a second question. Sorry, you mentioned how valuable these spaces are, and I wondered if your work into queerness and therefore this book, Queer Spaces, became an exploration of your own acceptance into your queerness. Sorry.
I think it's more. Yeah.
No, the second one is also very much applicable. So for the first question, it's not a very positive answer. So like I mentioned, so people who sometimes, if sometimes some people who are severely bullied or abused reproduce that relationship again and again, because somehow it becomes home. And unfortunately, looking back, like I very much have ended up in a sort of abusive relationship with my context repeatedly. And at this, on the one hand, it shouldn't have happened, because actually the kind of work that I wanted to do absolutely should not have been controversial in any way whatsoever. And I had to be like that in order to allow it to happen and not to disappear into, interior decoration in a parallel field. So yes, it had to happen for me to do the work that I want to do, but at the same time, I know that for years I was perpetuating a really unhealthy dynamic, which actually ended up putting me into Alcoholics Anonymous. I had breakdowns, and I got very unwell, very, very unwell. And, ended up on medication. And, I was receiving really severe abuse online from people who are quite well known. Rape threats, violence threats, lots of stuff that just shouldn't happen in the world of architecture and design. And basically, this leads to the second question. Over lockdown, there was like a reckoning for a lot of people, right? I think a lot of us were stuck inside and we were just with our demons. And so that happened to me, like it happened with many other people. And I just sort of reflected on all of this, but I was just so lucky to have this book, which the whole process began the week of the first lockdown. And I focused all of my energy on that while I was reflecting on the previous 20 years, the previous 20 years of what had come before that. And the book became a validation, because I was looking back, the most pronounced thing was the loneliness, like feeling completely alone. Like there wasn't even one architect of my generation in London that I could talk to, that I could be with, who was just interested, like just the same. And that loneliness is really psychologically damaging. And the book was the opposite. We ended up, there's 55 contributors from all over the world. And we had numerous conversations, profound conversations, fun conversations with them over the course of 2 years. And a lot of them got to know each other. And actually, there's already been a conference in Mexico of the contributors from Mexico City. Now the LATAM group, so the Latin American contributors are getting together and they're actually organizing a group, and they're becoming sort of organization and want to have an event. And like there are communities which are starting because of this, but we were part of those, and that was hugely validating to come across people all over the world, mostly younger, some older, some our age, that made us feel not alone, made me feel not alone. It made me feel, actually, I'm valid. And actually, because, you can be really, really tough and you can be really, really strong, but after like many, many years of gaslighting, there's a part of you, no matter how strong you are, that basically believes what they're all saying. And this kind of washed that away. And it's been hugely validating. And actually, it's not just for me, it's not just for Josh, but a lot of, like, we've had events where we've done book readings and people have burst into tears. They've, like one person in Edinburgh he said, I feel seen and I never knew that I wasn't seen. Like he just didn't know that this was a problem. And I had other people who felt seen for the first time after fighting for many, many years in the profession. So yeah, it's been a validatory project. So the second answer kind of refers to the first.
Yeah, I'll just say maybe a couple of things. So I don't know which one was which. Oh yes, so the first one, for what it's worth, I just try and I realize I'm in a position where I am an educator. I haven't had this position for very long, but I'm there. So I think there has to be self-reflection on one's pedagogical approaches. One has to create a culture of openness and respectability, and to constantly revise that and be aware of that. And I don't understand how that doesn't exist elsewhere. And I'd be mortified if I was to put a student in that situation. So I hope that speaks for something. I did make a note, I don't remember what it. And then, yes, and then I suppose the second question, and I'll be quick because of time. I think, yeah, in my case, doing this project has actually made me realize in a way that I hadn't before, because I was also, I did my PhD at ETH Zurich in sort of where I was quite otherist, and I noticed in retrospect that all these otherisms that have kind of been part of what I do is queer and has emerged from somewhere, but that self-reflectiveness perhaps hadn't emerged until I went through this process. And so I think it's also it's helped me change how I think about research very much as an activist project. But also, and I wanted to quote Bell Hooks, for those that read or know Bell Hooks, who said something like, the heart rather than the mind is the seat of learning. And so I try and follow that. So this is a heartfelt piece of research, for what that's worth, to your two beautiful questions.
Thank you. Anyone else? All the way in the back.
So yeah, I was wondering, could you maybe elaborate a bit more on the representation of queerness of your projects or the designs, or because they seem to have a certain representation, and you talk about the graphic design of it, and you want to research them, or know more about how you can use them also in your architecture. So I was wondering, could you tell a bit more about why you chose to have a certain representation?
So, I mean, I could do a whole other book on on that topic, but we very intentionally didn't sort of go down that avenue. I think Buchsbaum is probably the strongest example of kind of a designer exploring what I would call queer aesthetics. But no, I mean, in my work, it's explored in multiple different ways. So like there's, I'm not going to go in great detail with it now. I mean, if you come tomorrow, I think there's a bit more space to kind of talk about my work in detail, but it should be about the book today. But there's a few different threads and strands. There are a couple that explore specifically queerness in relation to themes that I find of great interest in my work, which are color, form, and ornamentation. And they tend to kind of bisect with kind of interest in kind of cross-pollination of different cultural elements. So there's a kind of thread of work that looks at that, but then there's also kind of queer methodologies in relation to architectural history and how I use those in architectural design, which is separate and different to that, and that tends to have the projects that have very explicit classical architectural elements, as well as very explicit historical ornamentation, tend to be on that end. So the kind of queer themes tend to be broken down into those two categories within my body of work. I've applied multiple times to do research projects on this, most recently for the Wheelwright Prize. I have never received a prize to be able to explore this kind of work in design if I've explicitly talked about the queerness of it. So the Design Museum and the Rome Prize was camouflage. So I was completely talking about other totally different things in order to get those. And I just don't want to do that anymore. But I would very much like to be able to have a research design project and time to be able to specifically explore the question that you asked within the framework of a didactic, or kind of within a project that is just about that, speaks about that through the design, clearly. My other work is commercial. I have to deal with clients, and I have to deal with clients that are very different from the kind of trendy architecture practices that have their students at trendy architecture schools who intern for them, and then they do stuff for biennales. Like, I don't have that. Like, I have to work for commercial clients, so it's very contingent. So it's kind of like what I can explore in the time frame with the budget allowed on that project. So it's very fragmented, and it's quite difficult for me to talk about. So yeah, I'm hoping that maybe in the future I'll be able to have more specific projects that are explaining that very clearly within one body of work.
One more question? There you go.
Yeah, so I'm kind of wondering how it comes that we are in this situation. Is it sort of related? Are we stuck in the paradigm of modernism, or because there's also, let's say, maybe many other groups on the side of society that don't feel welcome in the spaces that are general sort of around us. So could you expand a bit on that?
No, it's a great one. I mean, we can only do so much at once. But Adam in particular is kind of, for what it's worth, we've through this network we've been able to, if we can say so, I think we can say this. I don't think it's too it's sort of arrogant or something. But we've been able to find networks, for example, of people working on queer disability and helping them find those connections to the RIBA. They weren't going to go to the RIBA before this, okay? And I don't blame them. And in my case, I mean, there is a body of architectural historians. I can only really speak for the UK, where I'm very much, in my case, part of an active network of ED and I groups that were formed on the basis of the Equality Act. I forget what that was, but you know, groups of protected characteristics. So there's a race and ethnicity group, there's the queer network and the women's network and the disability network. And actually, it's extremely hard to actually fill those networks, which speaks for a rather conspicuous and alarming absence in in the culture of architectural history. So I'm speaking more perhaps for the discipline rather than for the spaces, but I think this is hopefully generative of somehow enabling these disciplinary revisionisms, let's say.
I mean, if we talk about modernism as a sort of like heteropatriarchal, racist, colonial project, then yeah, it's an issue because it's still around. And you know, the kind of mentality and the kind of very puerile, childish sort of logical syllogisms where aesthetics are moralized have just become, you know, part of our background kind of environment and atmosphere. Like people don't question a lot of these values, which are fundamentally aesthetic, but aesthetics are politics. And so that context, you know, is part of a broader kind of decolonizing project, which is happening across the world. But also, this book didn't happen absolutely didn't happen in a vacuum. There's another book, not from queer perspective, but from the perspective of people of color, which came out just before, called Sound Advice, which is from an absolutely groundbreaking organization called Sound Advice, which was founded by Joseph Zil-Henry and Pooja Agrawal, who, through sound, they sort of decolonize and question patriarchal structures in architecture. And the book there is sort of full of deeply profound, very heartfelt reflections on architectural culture and its exclusionality in the UK. And it's very telling, I think, that I don't think that there was a single major publication that reviewed it in the architecture community in London, but it's sold out twice. So there's a demand and an interest from the younger generation in these types of publications. There's the will and the energy from some people, again, who I think maybe felt quite isolated in previous years, but now with the support of Generation Z and a changing of mindsets, are feeling able to, for instance, make these kinds of publications and be publicly present. That is not limited to queerness, it is present for other, you know, marginalized groups like those who are people of color, and something that hasn't really been so present, but, you know, Josh just mentioned, is cripping and people of disability, and how that can also be brought to the fore in architectural discourse. So there's it's kind of like the 60s happening again, but that never really came into architecture, but sort of how kind of the complexity of contemporary society can maybe finally, for the first time in like 100 years, actually reach into architectural discourse. But the academy is a pretty closed place. Don't know if that will actually happen, but it's happening outside the academy. Sound Advice is a great example of that. Yeah, invite them, they're awesome.
Okay, guys, unless somebody really has a very pressing question, I'm going to abuse my position to ask my question. But it's it's just a procedural question as someone, well, our office, we've made some books, and I have a technical question with that background. Where did you start with the projects or with the spaces, or did you start with the authors?
Perhaps you could reflect on the RIBA part. So the project, I don't know, I suppose we started with a commission to do something very different that was focusing on queer nightlife, actually, specifically in London. And then we managed to use our persuasion to turn it into something completely
I told them no, go
different. Yeah. So that's where it started, and it started, I would say, more from perhaps networks rather than spaces, but it was a dialogue. What sort of spaces do we want to have? Where are the voids? It was a constant building up of a network. So providing a critical mass, by which I also mean a network that perhaps hadn't really been assembled with this complexity before. And using that as an enabler, and in that sense, it was very organic, and that was what produced what we have. Do you want to maybe talk about the RIBA?
No, I want to talk about that same thing.
All right.
Because that's kind of like the essence of the book, was that journey.
Yeah.
And I think, so just on practical terms, we started off like there was the kind of idea of this genre busting book that was like, is it a coffee table book? Is it a serious piece of, architectural history? Is it a sort of community group? Is it an atlas? Like basically just lots and lots of overlapping Venn diagram circles that we really bought into. But then, once it was accepted, which we didn't think it would be accepted, it's like, like, how the hell do we do that? And I think initially we sort of I think we both came up with our own lists of spaces, and they were just boring because they were spaces that we knew. And so then we had like types of spaces. So there's within that, and we didn't want to, nothing is didactically laid out. I think the way I just like describing it is it's an anti-Venturi Scott Brown, right? There's a kind of tendency within architecture culture to go like on a safari, right? Sort of, I'm going to go to, look at all of these sort of proletarians. Let's do diagrams, all you Princeton students, and let's go back and publish a book, and I own it. And, basically taking ownership of other people's cultures by publishing a book about something. And in a way, Susan Sontag's with Notes on Camp has that sort of safari quality to it, and we really didn't want to do that. So immediately we're like, okay, we need to expand beyond this, but we need a sort of series of types of spaces. We're not going to put them in the book, but they're going to define how we organize and how we kind of curate and commission spaces. And there are archives, the reappropriation of patriarchal symbols. There are the construction of alternative worlds, the construction of familial lineages, the creation of alternative families. Like there's a whole range of spaces that we wanted to have lots of examples of, but then each of those examples had to be from different geographic locations, they had to be from different time periods, and they also had to include different class backgrounds. So we had those types, and then we just hit our networks, and we just went out, and we forgot our list, and we spent 6 months kind of just going down. And this, I think, COVID was a weird function of how successful the book was, because almost everyone was locked down. And while Reba said they've never had such engaged contributors, and I think while they would have been very engaged otherwise, people were trapped at home all over the world, and this was like a kind of ray of sunshine. And even people who haven't contributed were part of the journey of finding groups of people in other countries who then told us about particular spaces, who then put us in contact with someone who was really interesting, who I'd never heard of. And so the journey of meeting people was really important, and sharing stories. And very often we'd come to find some amazing people, and they would be proposing spaces that it's like, oh my God, it's another nightclub. Like we can't, or it's another type of nightclub that we are, like a cis muscle man nightclub. We have too many of those. So, but then the contributor was perfect. And we also, we didn't want any of the star queer people. Like, 'cause there's like 5 people in the queer, the kind of queer star spectrum in the world, mostly in America, right, who everyone goes to for everything. And so we wanted to kind of platform a new generation of, as well as a kind of older generation that aren't so well known within kind of architectural design circles. So that put quite a limit on who we could invite. So once we found someone, even if they were who was the right person, who had the right spirit, who is sort of the right generation, who wasn't very well known but was really eager, if the space was wrong, and this happened a lot, we'd say, okay, not right space. These are the types of spaces we're looking for. Can you go on a journey? And frankly, probably because of COVID, people were just really happy to go on journeys and discovering stuff for themselves. So it's quite a kind of iterative backwards and forwards process, and we would meet up every other week, and we just run through the current list that we had. We'd talk about all the different contributors. Too many of these, not enough of that. How about the geographic locations was very important as well. And geographic locations, sometimes it was just not possible. So, for instance, to fill certain gaps, we only have one from the Arab or the only one from the Muslim world, and we want. There's a lot of spaces that we knew we wanted, but we also wanted people writing about those spaces who are from those countries. So we could have had French people writing about spaces in Tunisia, and we didn't want that. So there were limitations that are very glaring for us. Also, Eastern Europe was a big void for us. But, commission us here to do another edition, and we'll fill those in eventually.
Okay, guys, hooray for queer spaces. And hooray for Adam, hooray for Josh. Thank you.